Ladies and gentlemen, will you please welcome to the stage Professor Brian Cox.
Thank you. Thank you, and thank you for coming, and thank you for waiting. I don't think we expected that 1,000 of you would come out tonight, so thank you for coming to this discussion. So welcome to the Royal Society's second in the Science Matters series here at the Victoria Warehouse, Manchester. Now, tonight we'll be discussing GM crops and the part they play in the future of the food we eat. Now, this venue actually makes a fitting venue to discuss the future of food and GM crops. In the 20th century, this warehouse was built to store cotton, a crop which came to define the industrialization not just of this city, but vast swathes of what was then the British Empire. But later, this warehouse became a storage point for both Kellogg's and McVitie's, two giants of the global food industry. And we're also in what could well be the epicenter of British vegetarianism. Did you know that? Yeah. Because it was in Salford's appropriately named Beefsteak Chapel, where the Reverend, this is true, the Reverend Cowherd, it says here. I didn't actually write this, so I'm not sure. It sounds too good to be true, doesn't it? But in the Beefsteak Chapel, the Reverend Cowherd first told his congregations to abstain from meat eating 200 years before meat is murder by the Smiths. Anyway, one of modern humans' greatest achievements was the invention of agriculture and the manipulation of wild species of grasses and roots to provide tastier, more nutritional food on demand. And the first farmed wheat and barley species were being cultivated over 11,000 years ago. Now, for millennia, we've largely dictated the terms on which we grow and consume our food to reach the point we're now at, where in the developed world, we're able to take our pick from out-of-season produce all year round or eat foodstuffs sourced from the furthest reaches of the globe. But are we reaching a point where these options will be taken away from us? Have we reached peak food? Widespread famine and droughts have already led to dramatic crises in East Africa and the Middle East. In 2015, some 800 million people didn't get enough calories to reach their minimum dietary intake. And this isn't a problem that's going away. With climate change and the seemingly inexorable demands of a growing world population steeped in inequality. To put this into perspective, the world population currently stands at more than 7 billion, and it's predicted to reach 8 billion in 2024 and 9 billion by 2040. So in the coming decades, will we be forced to make dramatic changes to the way that we grow our food? And if so, how best can we make the transition? We must make tough choices on the things we choose to eat. Or must we make tough choices on the things we choose to eat? Or will these decisions be made for us by food multinationals and policymakers? Can science and technology help smooth the path to a more sustainable future? Well, to answer these questions tonight, I'm joined by a panel of some of the UK's leading experts on plant biology, botany, and food policy to talk about the future of food security. And we'll also be sampling some of the ingredients we could see entering our food chain in the coming years and getting our panel's take on what our dinners of tomorrow might taste like. Were there insects to eat, by the way? There were, weren't there? Did you eat them? Good? It might be the future. We'll have that as a question, actually. So without further ado, please help me welcome our panel to the stage. So welcome, and our panel are going to introduce themselves. So we start.
Hello, yes, my name is Ottoline Leyser. I work at the University of Cambridge, and I'm a plant developmental biologist, which means what I'm really interested in is how plants grow, how they decide what shapes they should take up. And in particular, I work on how branchy they should be. and how they decide how branchy to be, and how the roots and the shoots talk to each other to make that decision, and how the different shoots talk to one another to make that decision. Kind of signaling processes that go on that modulate shoot branching. And to illustrate that in a foodie way, I brought a very seasonal food, and that's this Brussels sprout. Because this Brussels sprout is a branch. You might not think it's a branch, but it is. A cabbage is the main shoot of a Brussels sprout type plant, and the Brussels sprout is a side shoot. And if you get them in the supermarket, you can see them on the side of that main shoot. And so I'm interested in how plants decide how branchy they should be. And I bought some other brassicas as well, a cauliflower and a broccoli, because actually all of those plants, all of them are the same species, and the difference between them are a very small number of rather interesting mutations that change the way the plant grows and develops, which is the kind of process I'm interested in, that we've selected through classical breeding over the years, because they give us different parts to eat that we think taste nice, or not, as the case may be. I don't really like Brussels sprouts, but there you go.
Good evening. My name's David Baulcombe. I'm Professor of Botany in Cambridge University right now. We're going to be talking this evening about genetically modified crops, and this is something I've been working on for a long time. In fact, my laboratory produced some of the first ever genetically modified plants in the early 1980s that were resistant against diseases. And this is a furrow that I've continued to plow ever since then. I hope you like the reference there. And we still work on various things to do with plants and their genomes and changing them. And we've developed an interest more recently in tomatoes. And so I brought along this giant tomato to bring to you. Now, the reason why I've brought this is three reasons. I wanted to make 3 points. The first is this is a modern tomato, and as you can see, it's very big and it's nicely colored. Had I brought along a wild tomato, it would look a bit like one of Ottoline's sprouts. It would be small and green and not very flavorsome. And so what this illustrates is that the whole process of plant breeding over the years has actually released information that was in the genome, in the DNA of this plant, and it somehow released the potential so that it can look like this. So point one is there's a lot of potential in genomes. And those of us interested in food and agriculture are trying to find ways of unlocking that potential. The second point I wanted to make, and it may not apply to this particular tomato, but a lot of tomatoes are hybrids. You'll go into your garden store or your supermarket, and the tomatoes you'll buy will be F1 hybrids. And there's something funny happens when you make a hybrid between two plants. Sometimes when you make a hybrid between two people as well, it's called a child, and the child is quite different from the parents, often much more vigorous than the parents. And so this is a manifestation of something called hybrid vigor. And again, this is an illustration of how there's potential in genomes that we don't fully understand, that we as scientists and people interested in agriculture can unlock. And then the third point I want to make is not necessarily related to this tomato, but the first ever commercially produced GM crops were a type of tomato called flavor saver tomato. And the reason why these were thought to be a good idea by the people that developed them was that they didn't go squishy on the shelves after you'd picked them. And we're going to be talking this evening about waste and how we eliminate or reduce the amount of waste and spoilage that we get of crops. And actually, this first ever GM tomato was a very good example of how you can stop things wasting using technology.
Hi, I'm Claire Maris. I'm a senior lecturer at the Centre for Food Policy at City, at the University of London. And I started off as a biologist a long, long time ago, and I was one of the first people in the UK, along with David, to make a GM plant in a laboratory as part of my PhD. But when I finished my PhD, I decided I was more interested in the way science develops and the way science is used by governments and the way in which people think about science and what role science plays in our society. So I converted to social sciences. So today I'm a sociologist, and I'm a sociologist of science. And I've ended up spending the last 20, 30 years actually studying the controversy on GM crops and studying the way in which governments have regulated them and assessed the risks and how they think about them and how they've tried to engage with members of the public like yourselves about what to do about GM crops and whether to authorize them or not. And now that I've at the Center for Food Policy, one of my big interests and the interests of my center is how can we develop science policy and food policy which actually takes into account people's voices. How can we engage and get people involved in the policy-making process, and how can we make policy that takes into account people's real lived experiences, how they actually feel in their day-to-day lives. And a lot of policy hasn't done that in the past, and we think it's important that it should. And what I brought along with us today is a packet of lentils for a number of reasons. First, I don't know if anybody knows here, but 2016 is the year of the pulses. It was declared the year of pulses by the FAO, the Food and Agricultural Organization of the United Nations, because they believe that lentils and other pulses, beans and chickpeas and things like that, have a huge role to play in food security and in tackling malnutrition in the world and in also making agriculture more environmentally sustainable. And the other reason I brought a packet rather than sort of just a handful of lentils is to sort of point out it within the food system. Most of us, certainly in the UK and in developing countries, get most of our food, like 90% of our food, from supermarkets. So supermarkets play an incredibly important role in the food system and in food security.
Okay, hello everybody. I'm Phil Stevenson. I'm Professor of Plant Chemistry, and I work at the Royal Botanic Gardens at Kew. And I'm at the Natural Resources Institute. Now, I'm a plant chemist, which means I study the chemicals that plants produce, not the nutritional ones, the chemicals they produce that help them defend themselves naturally against pests and diseases. And to illustrate that, I've brought a carrot. But due to supply issues at the supermarket, this was meant to be a sweet potato. So if you'll bear with me and pretend this is actually a peeled sweet potato, I'd really appreciate that. So I've brought today a peeled sweet potato. And one thing you'll notice about this peeled sweet potato is that it's orange. It's got orange flesh, which is a very important quality. Now, I'm personally interested in sweet potatoes because they're a very important staple food of very poor people in sub-Saharan Africa, which is where I do most of my work. And that's a very important quality of this. It's a staple food. It's produced under very harsh conditions where not many other things might grow. It's very generous in productivity. It's easy to propagate. But actually, the sweet potatoes that Africans grow are generally white and high dry matter. So they're quite tough. And the ones that you're probably more familiar with are orange flesh, like the ones that you get in America. Now, part of the work I was involved with was actually looking at natural resistance to insects. And they have these land races in Africa which are kind of historic remnants of old breeding programs, I guess, and they're very diverse genetically, and they have a lot of very interesting natural characters. And one of the characters I've been looking at is the natural resistance in these plants to insects. And some of my colleagues have been looking at natural resistance to viruses as well. So let me just bring you back to the orange bit. So this is the third quality that we're trying to get into sweet potatoes in Africa. Natural resistance to insects, natural resistance to viruses, but orange flesh, because orange flesh is from beta-carotene. And this is the precursor to vitamin A. And vitamin A is a huge deficiency problem in the world. Millions of children die every year. And the problems and cost of actually treating all those children, because their diet is inadequate, is very expensive and, again, not entirely sufficient. So what some of my colleagues in Africa have been doing is trying to breed American sweet potatoes with African sweet potatoes. And actually they've done it, and they've produced this fantastic array of new potatoes that are now going to provide a lot of people in sub-Saharan Africa with vitamin A that they might otherwise not have had. And it's an interesting alternative to the golden rice story that some of you may be familiar with. In this particular case, it's a naturally occurring source of beta-carotene. But it also allows us to sort of think about some of the hardships that people suffer from and the issues that people face, and how much of the technology that we're going to talk about tonight can all be directed at addressing some of these issues.
Thank you. Well, so let us get going immediately then. I should say that the questions that I'm going to ask are all questions from you. And of course, I won't be able to ask all of them, so I apologize for that. But they've been excellent questions. And the first one I'd like to start with is from Simeon and Emily. And I'll ask the question to Ottoline to start, which is, over the last 12,000 years or so, humans have been selectively breeding almost everything they could get their hands on. It's a nice phrase, isn't it? Could the panel explain the difference in results between breeding and GM? And the follow-up is, are we doing things that are totally impossible with breeding when we use GM?
So I think that's a great question to start with. So indeed, we have been, agriculture was kind of invented about 12,000 years ago, and it's an extraordinary invention. I think to answer that question, a good place to start is to ask why did we invent agriculture? And I think it's particularly important in the way that we think about food today. We have this funny idea that natural is good for you, unnatural, bad for you. But the reason we had to invent agriculture in the first place is that naturally, plants don't really want to be eaten. Naturally, plants that have evolved by natural selection have, as we've already heard, a huge array of quite substantive defenses to protect themselves from being eaten. Obviously, natural selection is survival of the fittest, survival of the ones that make the most seed and get their genes into the next generation. And if you've been eaten, you're not going to be very successful at that. And particularly when you think about the fact that a lot of our calories come from seed or the storage organs from plants that allow them to persist from generation to generation or from year to year, those particular things are hotly defended by plants. So people do know this. You don't say to your children, go into the woods and eat anything you can find because it's natural, so it must be good for you. That's not how it is. Seeds and storage organs are quite often really quite poisonous. So when we were inventing agriculture, at some level what we embarked on is a kind of way to break free from the evolutionary arms race which goes on normally, where organisms that don't want to be eaten defend themselves, and then the organisms that want to eat them evolve ways to deal with the defenses. We've gone with essentially unilateral disarmament of plants. We've put them into fields, we're nice to them, they don't need to defend themselves from anything else anymore, we fertilize them, we water them, so they get a free run, but in return, they allow us to eat most of what they make. But then we save some seed and go around again. So it's the whole process of the invention of agriculture is a profoundly unnatural process, and it's profoundly unnatural because that's better for us. So the closer a plant is to nature, the more likely it is to kill you. This is an important thing to remember. So 12,000 years of turning these plants that used to be defending themselves in nature into plants that behave well in agriculture and feed us. The giant tomatoes that we've already seen, for example, are a very good example of that. That would never have evolved naturally. But getting to the specific question, can we do things with genetic modification that you can't do with conventional breeding? And the answer to that is yes. And the reason for that is that the key difference between conventional breeding and genetic modification is with genetic modification, you are taking a gene as an isolated entity, a bit of DNA, and introducing that into the genome of your crop plant. And that gene can come from organisms with which that plant could not normally breed. It could be a closely related plant that nonetheless has a crossbreeding kind of barrier, or it could be an altogether different species. A lot of the early applications, the genes come originally from bacteria. Now, it's not that no genes move around in nature like that. There's an awful lot we know now of what's called horizontal gene transfer, where you can get genes moving from across the so-called species barrier, because viruses, for example, which infect you, can take bits of DNA out of your genome and then put them into another organism. So it's not completely unnatural or completely unheard of, but nonetheless, the probability of being able to do the kinds of things that we've done with GM through conventional breeding is vanishingly small. So you can do things with GM that you can't do with conventional breeding.
David, I think.
There's been quite a lot written about the difference between agriculture through conventional breeding and GM, and actually there's a very good section on the Royal Society website that spells this out. If you ever get confused by all of the technicalities that you read in these various places, I think it's very easy to remember the difference between them. So conventional breeding and agriculture, as it's been done for the last 10,000 years, involves sex, and GM doesn't. So sex versus not sex. It's very easy to remember. Now, when you think about sex from the point of view of the genome, because I expect you all do that all of the time, when you think about sex from the point of view of the genome, it's a very messy business indeed. So if you take two plants and you hybridize them together, and that's what conventional plant breeders do, you're taking 20,000 genes from one parent, 20,000 genes from the other parent, and you're mixing them up together. And the potential for unknown unknowns when you do that is absolutely huge. When a conventional breeder makes a population, when he does this, he will select, or she, out of the tens of thousands of plants that come out of that cross and identify the one that they want. With GM, the sexless process, it's to some extent simpler. You're often taking one or a small set of genes and you're adding them into a variety of plant that might be otherwise quite good, and you just want to make it a little bit better. So that's how to remember the difference between these different approaches: sex versus not sex, complicated and messy versus relatively simple.
Yeah. And I know you wanted to, could you be quite brief?
Yes,
though,
to be very brief, because I think we'll come back to this issue later, but there's another big difference between GM and non-GM, which is that GM crops can be patented by the people who've created them, and plants created with conventional breeding more or less count. There's other kinds of property rights you can have, but they can't be patented, and that makes a big difference.
It leads us on to the next question, actually, which was asked by Patrick, Sophie, Emma, and Peter. Asked, why is there so much skepticism around GM crops? I suppose, as you've described it, there's no fundamental difference between standard breeding and GM. It's more targeted. So why the skepticism?
I think we have to be careful with that question. It's like it's often like, what do we mean by people being skeptical? Or often here, as a sociologist, I'm often asked, so you work on GM crops, so you must be able to tell us why are people scared of GM crops, and how can we make them accept them better? And I find that question in itself a bit of a problem, because I saw we got about 200 questions, I think, from this audience. So it was a really interesting set of questions. We won't be able to address all of them. I didn't see any of them there that said GM crops are bad and unnatural, and I think they're really scary. There were questions maybe about how they're regulated, about how they fit in, to what extent can they contribute to food security, to what extent they might have long-term effects on the environment. But there were questions. There weren't people saying they're really bad and we must ban them straight away. So I think we have, and there's different people, members of the public. It's just it's a very big category. People have different opinions and different ideas, which will be based on what their personal experiences are. And in the research I've done, and other people in social sciences have done about public opinions and attitudes towards GM, we find that people will think about their own experiences of how large companies behave. So that's why I mentioned the patents, because your opinion to GM crops changes if you know that most GM crops are actually produced by large multinational companies and that they can have patents. And so it fits into how you feel about big companies and how you've experienced the influence of big companies in your life. If you know that governments regulate the safety of GM crops, you'll have ideas about how governments have sometimes failed to regulate some past things. So in the 1990s, we had BSE. More recently, we had the horse meat scandal. So we know that governments, however willing that they try to make food safe for us, that there are ways in which they might not always be able to do that, and they might not always be able to counteract the influence of big corporations.
Yes.
I wonder if it might have been a different story from the start had the target for that technology been different. If the target for the technology had been addressing directly a food security issue in a very needy part of the world, perhaps it would have engaged public opinion much more strongly than perhaps a very commercial-oriented application. And I think that could have made a big difference to how it was perceived. But I do think with 20 years of evidence that perhaps there's a sort of a change in people's perception more broadly?
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I think part of the problem when GM crops were first developed in the 1990s is that there was what the people who were creating them, private sector and public sector, were all saying it's going to save the world, it's going to help people who were poor and undernourished in the kinds of, the golden rice has been talked about for a long, long time. We were going to have food that was going to be good for small farmers, good for poor people. And the actual crops that were developed are actually much more useful for wealthy farmers in wealthy countries and are mostly used to feed animals to produce meat. They're not actually directly consumed by human beings anywhere in the world. So that the gap between the people saying it's going to save the world and actually what we saw coming out of the labs and the companies was noticed by people who said, well, we don't understand. You told us it was going to save the world, and what we see is GM soya to feed cows.
So I agree with a lot of this discussion. I think one of the things that's interesting about the way the debates move forward is, so, I mean, clearly the food system is incredibly complicated, and we'll be talking about that, I think, a little bit later going forward. It's a complex system, it's got all kinds of different parts, and there are anxieties about the way parts of it are moving forward. For example, the domination by big multinational companies, intensification, all kinds of things that worry people. And from where I was sitting as the debate rolled forward, what happened was GM has become a kind of watchword, a kind of poster child for the notion of nasty agriculture that's worrying. And it's very easy to understand why that is. There's anxiety about the way different parts of the food chain are moving, and I think that's valid and appropriate anxiety that we need to pay attention to and indeed address the issues that have caused that. But the trouble is, actually, those issues have absolutely nothing to do with GM as a technology. Really nothing. And so the drawback with the fact that GM has become the kind of magnet for that anxiety is that the real issues are not getting the attention they deserve. Instead, we're all rushing around worrying about whether we should or shouldn't have GM, rather than how we should or shouldn't patent particular seeds, or how we should or shouldn't incentivize the development of agriculture for orphan crops in the third world. The key questions in our food system can go unaddressed because people think they're fighting the good fight by fighting GM, and they're not. And I think shifting the focus back onto what the real questions are and then addressing them is much more important.
There is actually perhaps a related question, though, which I might ask to David, which was asked by Joshua and Victoria, which is that if we design disease-resistant crops, could we not unintentionally create future invasive species? So I suppose this goes to some of the skepticism. Some of it, much of it, as you say, is perhaps the industrial use of GMs, patents, etc. But there is this fear that you can create some kind of Frankenstein-type organism.
It's a very good point, because one of the early innovations from GM was disease resistance, or has been and continues to be disease resistance. Now, if you're a farmer, disease resistance is a hugely important issue. You've got to address disease in your crops one way or another. It's often done by spraying chemicals on your crops. Not always desirable, not always possible in some parts of the world, not possible to get the chemicals that you would need. Much better, if you can, to have disease-resistant crops. Now, we've been developing disease-resistant crops throughout agriculture, and one of the innovations of the Green Revolution was the introduction of disease resistance into crops. So when you ask questions about disease resistance and the consequence for invasive GM species, you have to ask the same question about disease-resistant conventionally bred crops as well. And I think it just brings into focus how a lot of the issues and the concerns that one might have about GM are actually not different from the issues and concerns that all of us should and could have about conventionally bred crops. We have to bear in mind that, you know, agriculture is, in terms of area, probably the most environmentally invasive industry that our civilization carries out. And we need to think very hard about all forms of agriculture, conventional agriculture, GM agriculture. We've got to really think about the consequences of any technology that we introduce.
Yeah, I mean, because we had several questions actually around this sort of issue, which you said is an issue not necessarily focused on GM. For example, one from Chris, which was that if we make these highly pest-resistant crops, then are we in danger of making sterile fields with no wildlife because we affect the balance of the ecosystem?
Yeah, I'll answer that. Actually, they're already, they're already very sterile environments anyway, because many of our crops are just uniform spaces, and of course that's a very unnatural environment already. By having pest resistance, all we're doing is reducing the incidence of one or two species within that environment. But what we need to do perhaps more is develop the whole ecosystem to support a diversity of species that can maintain the ecosystem services that environment needs as well. So it's a very valid point. I mean, I think going back to kind of some of the fears about GM foods is where a lot of headlines are around, say, herbicide resistance, which seems like a curious application of this technology, and there are potentially outcomes for that kind of approach where, in fact, in the United States, herbicide use is actually increased as a consequence of the use of herbicide-tolerant GM crops. And one of the consequences of that is there are fewer weeds around farms, and there's less nectar, there's less pollen for pollinators and other beneficial insects that are, say, natural enemies. So I think that is a very serious consequence that we need to be very mindful of, that increase in the use of herbicides associated with this technology.
So just very quickly, though, you can also make herbicide-tolerant crops without GM. So that when people say GM crops do X, like are bad for biodiversity, that's never going to be a true statement because it depends entirely on what the GM modification was. And you have to ask this question that David also raised, can you also do that with conventional? So again, there's this problem of it sticking onto GM, a problem that is not caused by GM, it's caused by other things.
Just a quick look. I agree with this idea that we must, it's not just about GM, and that the skepticism is actually about the kind of agricultural system that we've developed, and so a lot of skepticism is about intensive agriculture, the kind of monocropping, which is very sterile and which is having environmental impacts. But I think I would disagree a little bit with this idea that means the debate isn't about GM, because the point is that we've had GM for the last 20 years. The GM crops that have been developed, so 99% of the GM crops that are being grown in the world are herbicide resistant or have this gene called Bt gene against a particular set of pests. So that's the GM we have. So when people talk about GM, they're talking about the GM that we have.
Yep.
And to tell them, well, actually, you should be talking about some other GM that doesn't exist yet, I think is a bit difficult.
Well, that wasn't the point I was making. The point I was making was that those problems are equally applicable to non-GM crops. Sure. And I hope we can talk a little bit about why we don't have more interesting GM crops in a minute.
Well, that was a point I wanted to get onto. So, yes, you can talk about the GM we have that is in the fields at the moment, and you're absolutely right, it's relatively limited. The GM that's in the laboratories or almost in the fields is actually hugely diverse, and it addresses a range of different issues that are of concern to all sorts of farmers, growers, consumers. So we're talking about nutritionally enhanced crops. We're talking about crops that can withstand, to some extent, drought, that can tolerate diseases, that don't spoil on the shelves subsequently. These are waiting in the wings, as it were, just outside there. They're ready to go. And we've got a regulatory framework, unfortunately, that discourages the involvement of non-governmental organizations, that discourages the involvement of small to medium-sized enterprises, that could facilitate the introduction and the use of these technologies in all sorts of contexts, not only industrial agriculture, but there is the potential, and it's, I think, rather regrettable that the discussion that has taken place over the last 20 or 30 years has been so polarized, because that has resulted in let's say, a lack of dialogue between people interested in biotechnology and people interested in environmental agriculture, organic agriculture. There's actually huge potential for bringing these approaches together and getting something really good out of that. Highly regrettable that we haven't moved further, I think, on that agenda.
It's actually, there's a related question. Sarah asked, it's in the past tense actually, what has been your favorite GM application so far? But we could also extend that, as you said, the exciting technologies that are in the lab at the moment. So maybe, what can you see that would be, you think would, let's say, make the biggest impact in terms of an application?
Well, I think you could give two examples. So one that is almost there, that is really in the wings, and this is late blight resistant potatoes. So any of you who are gardeners, allotment holders or whatever, late blight will have been the scourge of your potato crop for the last several summers. We now have a range of varieties of potato that have been developed using GM that are resistant against late blight. Could be useful for allotment holders, could be very useful for farmers, many of whom will drive a tractor over their fields a dozen times in a growing season in order to counteract the effects of late blight. So that's a very good example.
Yeah, I've got a couple if I can.
Yeah.
One that's currently in use. I spent my PhD, I was in South India working on groundnuts. This is peanuts. They use it to make oil. And they had a really serious problem with pesticide resistance. They were using pyrethroids, a real serious problem with pesticide resistance in one of the key pests of this crop. And farmers' crops were failing, and the pesticide didn't work against the pest, so the farmers used it on themselves. I mean, it was a real tragedy, and it was a real eye-opener for me. But one of the other things I learned at the time was over 50% of all the chemicals used to control pests in India at the time, over 50% were used on cotton. And cotton occupied only 3% of the agricultural land. So I guess for me, my favorite technology is BT cotton, because it has actually really addressed a very, very serious issue. And there has been economic studies that have shown over very long periods of time that it's actually had a benefit to those poor farmers. And so it really has addressed an issue that was real and tangible and has delivered. The other one that I quite like the idea of is a little bit closer to my own area of work, which is kind of chemical ecology, these plants that produce interesting chemicals that mediate interactions with the environment around them, the pests, the beneficial insects, the pollinators. And this was a study that was actually led at Rothamsted, where they tried to get an aphid alarm pheromone called farnesene into a wheat plant. Now, wheat doesn't naturally produce this, but lots of plants do, and they produce it as a natural defense because it's evolved in other situations to actually disperse pests. And so it's an incredible use of our knowledge about chemical ecology and how plants use chemicals. Unfortunately, it worked in the laboratory, but when they tried it in the field, it failed. But for me, it was going really along the right lines. It was taking these fantastic and interesting natural mechanisms and manipulating them just a little bit to make them function. So
I think it's also a very interesting question. It maps back onto this question as to why we only have currently, and have for a long time, these two applications. And we've had some very interesting examples about what's about to hit. But to me, many of the most exciting GM applications are never going to be in the field, because one of the things that GM as a technology has done is completely transformed the tools we have available to understand how plants work. So this is the work that we're doing in the lab. Plants that are contained in the lab will never get out and are anyhow engineered to do things that are completely useless. So you stick an inherently fluorescent protein onto your favorite protein, you put it into the plant you're studying, and now you can see in real time with high quality microscopy techniques where that protein is, how it's moving in the plant. So you can find out how plants work. And genetic modification has been absolutely transformative in working out how plants work, in understanding what they do, how they respond to the environment. And that knowledge that we've generated is going to be useful across agriculture, however you're doing your agriculture, whatever the genetics of your crop. The fact that we now understand so much more about how they resist stresses, how they respond to pathogens, all these kinds of stuff, will absolutely and already is very important in feeding into agronomy, how you manage crops, as well as the genetics of the seed that you put into the ground in the first place.
So I have a question that's linked again, I think, asked by Colin, which goes to this, as you mentioned, I think, Phil, this idea that you can get fields without weeds, and that's actually entirely problematic for biodiversity. The question was, how compatible are biodiversity and food security?
Yes, well, very essentially compatible, in my opinion. I've done a lot of work with pollinators, and I'm currently working in bean fields in Tanzania, trying to harness ecosystem services from those environments, from those field margins. And it's a very important part of agricultural intensification. And without that knowledge and know-how, without the biodiversity, we will be unstuck. There are many crops, something like 75% of the top 100 crops, food crops that we grow, require pollination of some description. It might not be in volume terms, because that's obviously taken up by the main cereals and the roots, but it's a very important part of delivering a lot of the food we eat. And in fact, the 5 a day, all the 5 a day that we need to eat are all dependent upon pollinators. So they're a very important part of our ecosystems. But actually what's important for all of these crops, and this is particularly so for perhaps the smallholder farmers, are the natural enemies. These are insects that occur naturally that feed on the pests that are the farmer's problem. And we can support all of these ecosystem services by managing our ecosystems much more intelligently. So it's a very, very good question. There is one example I have where perhaps the farmers would disagree with the issue of biodiversity. I had a project in Nepal working on chickpeas, trying to control pests and pathogens of chickpeas. But the main problem the farmers had were actually one-horned rhino. And it was very hard to think of a way of helping them deal with this. But actually, it is a little bit amusing. But actually, on the other hand, it also illustrates some of the challenges that some of the farmers actually face, where we're desperately trying to save the wildlife, save rhinos, and there are people living right next door who are desperately trying to grow chickpeas to feed their families. So all of these questions are very complicated and full of challenges.
I think my point is an extension of that. So you can go back to the Garden of Eden, where the biodiversity would have been wonderful and infinite almost. And then as soon as Adam and Eve and their offspring decided that they needed to grow plants, grow crops in order to feed themselves, there would have been a tension between the biodiversity of the Garden of Eden and their needs. And this tension continues. There's an inevitable tension between agriculture, which is a controlled ecosystem, if you like, and the ecosystem that would otherwise develop outside of the agricultural system. I think there's a lot of work to be done here. So in some settings, your best solution is to spare land for biodiversity by cultivating crops as intensively as you can. As long as you manage the spared land appropriately, then you can keep your biodiversity index high. In some areas, the approach might be slightly different or quite different. You might choose to have an extensive, less intensive agriculture and to mix your biodiversity together with the farming environment. And I think there is no one answer to that, but we have to be aware of it. And we have to be aware of the fact that preserving biodiversity as part of all of the ecosystem services that the experts like to refer to is actually a very important issue. It's not just about chiff-chaffs and greenfinches and all of that sort of stuff as aesthetic. They're an integral part of the planet in which we live, and we do have to look after this. We have to manage this tension.
Yeah, I think we're going to go and try some food in a minute over there. But I just want to get one more question in before we do, which is to Claire initially, which is it's a question from Jeff. How can the potential long-term effects of GM crops be assessed now? I suppose the implication is before we go all the way down the line.
So that's a really difficult challenge, and again, for GM crops or any other crops. But for GM crops, we've been trying to do it in a systematic way. And what we do when we try and do assessments of GM crops, we might feed them to rats, or to see within 30 days or 90 days whether they exhibit any ill effects, and that's obviously very short term. If a rat dies, then that's quite severe, something, or if their livers are really enlarged. But even if they survive and all the rats in that experiment are fine, that doesn't mean that they aren't going to be potentially, if we start feeding these crops to millions, billions of human beings, that there might not be some effects. And you can't do that kind of experiment in 90 days within a lab. So basically, we do have an experiment on the go now where we're all eating GM. Even in Europe, we're eating some GM foods or foods derived from GM crops. And the problem is, how can we monitor that? Who's monitoring it? We have most of the food that's derived from GM crops isn't labeled, so we don't even know we're eating it. So if there was some negative effects, we wouldn't know it, and we wouldn't be able to report it. Our GPs wouldn't be able to make a link between anything that might happen and the fact that we've been eating GM. Now, I'm not saying that GM crops are killing people or making people ill, but I just think it's very difficult to have a system in place that actually would be able to measure that. And so any sort of bland statement or blanket statement that GM crops are safe and we know they have no ill effects is difficult to justify when we don't actually have the evidence to say that.
Okay, so I think it is time now to look at some food. I'd like to invite to the stage Charles Michel, who's a chef. Very good chef, Michelin star chef, in fact. So, big welcome, Charles. Hello, Brian. So, the idea is to look at foods that we may well see more of, unusual foods at the moment, but we may see more of in the future. But could you just explain a little bit of your background and your interest in this subject?
Sure. So, I was trained as a chef, worked in several Michelin star restaurants, trying to understand how to make food delicious from a technical perspective. After a few years, I met the professor from Oxford, Charles Spence, and he's doing research he's an experimental psychologist, neuroscientist, and he does research on trying to understand how we decide which foods to purchase, and basically how we form our preferences. By integrating information from all our senses. So I got kind of interested into how do we design experiences, products that make people go for the right choices and also be more mindful and more mindful about what they eat.
Yeah, and they're just arriving here actually. So what have we got? So these are all going to be things with which we're not particularly familiar at the moment. Well, I'm not familiar with that.
Yeah. What is that? So actually, so here I'm going to show a little bit about an idea that's got, thinking of vegetables that we can eat them from root to flower. So here we have actually a beetroot, so it's a root, and we usually only eat this part. This one's one that had a long time to grow. But we can also eat the leaves, and something that we rarely think of. Just like these leek, we only eat these parts. This is what we find in the supermarket. This is completely edible. I use it in one of the preparations. And this is completely edible as well. So we can increase, probably double the yield of this particular crop just by looking at it with a different eye.
I'm now embarrassed because I didn't recognize a beetroot. There's red things that come in jars, aren't they? Carry on.
So, and also some things that are a bit more high-tech, like, for example, these shoots, these sprouts that are grown in a tube station in London with LED lights and using aquaponic systems. So getting the nature in the ground and using kind of energy, like renewable energy sources to light them up.
I actually visited a place doing that in London a few weeks ago, where the LED lights are tuned, aren't they, to very specific the frequencies that the plant needs. Mm-hmm. So very energy efficient way of growing crops. Yeah. And what particular crop was that? Oh, mustard.
Yeah, this is mustard, and also there's this very interesting one. These are potatoes that are grown in a salt farm. So they're trying to, these guys in Holland are trying to figure out how much salt water can certain crops take. So this one in particular has a very nice flavor too, and it's made with water that's not completely salt water, but it's definitely using less water than a normal potato crop. Yeah.
So the plan is that we're going to taste some of these inventions. So actually, I'd like to invite everybody across, because we're going to do one of those sort of Sunday brunch type things, I think, is the plan. Did anyone else know? Is it completely obvious, is it, that that's a beetroot? I suppose it should be obvious,
Beautiful.
shouldn't it?
That's what I get in my allotment.
Is it? Yeah. You don't get many of these at the Large Hadron Collider. Anyway.
There's also something very interesting with this one, is that you can actually cut the leaves and eat the leaves as salad. You can cook them, you can eat them raw, and leave the root to grow. So there's kind of a different approach also to how we grow vegetables. Here also, so this is actually, well, looking at food waste with this philosophy of root to flower, of using the whole plant. Here you have the stalks of the beetroot, you have the leaves, you have also the leaves of a Brussels sprout. The leaves and the stems can also be eaten and presented in a kind of artistic manner. Part of the research I've been doing at Oxford is to show that people are willing to pay more for a dish when it's beautifully presented. They enjoy it more. Basically, they get more pleasure out of the same amount of the same ingredients if it has some kind of effort and skill into the presentation. Something that we rarely think of as taking part of flavor perception, what we see, but it plays a huge role. So here we have some of those potatoes. So this is basically kind of a seafood dish without fish. So it's, we have some seaweeds. Here's a halophyte that grows near the sea that's samphire, so you can find it quite easily. It gives a lot of salt to these potatoes also, but the potatoes also, without necessarily adding salt in the cooking, have a really strong flavor. And of course, this is dulse. It's also seaweed that grows a lot around here, and there's a lot to find in the...
There's actually a question here for Adele, Tanya, and Nicola asked, because I noticed that this is all vegetables, and you said a seafood dish without fish. The question was, do we all need in the future to become vegans or vegetarians? Is that possibly going to be necessary?
I think it's about a balance, right? I personally became kind of a weekday vegetarian or weekday vegan, so 5 days a week, eat mostly vegetables, there's plenty of things, and then when we go to the meat or to the animal, do it, cook it properly and and really enjoy it. Just not having meat as a default.
Is it clear that we will have to cut down on meat and fish? And does everyone agree with that?
Yes, I think we need to cut down on everything. That's my one bit of advice. Stop eating as much. I think really we could do an awful lot for sustainable food production if we ate less.
But it is also true that meat is a particular issue because if you think about the food chain, what you're doing when you eat meat is you're eating something that's eaten a plant. And every level up the food chain, you lose an awful lot of energy, just rather obviously. The cows rushing around the field burning off calories. And those calories could be yours if you had eaten the grass. Okay, so maybe we don't want to eat grass. But the place where that cow is grazing, you could grow arable, and that arable, so it is very inefficient in terms of calorie per unit land to grow meat because of that food chain problem.
Cows are particularly bad, actually, aren't they? I mean, is it about 10, they have to eat 10 times their body weight to produce, so 10 kilos produces 1 kilo of cow.
Yep.
But if we were to be totally vegetarian, we would be denying ourselves the opportunity of having mixed farming systems where you've got the livestock that provide the manure that feeds the arable crops. We would be denying the farmers of the uplands of Britain in Wales and Scotland, for example, of the opportunity of making a living from having sheep on the fells. And so I think it's all a question of balance. It's having a balanced diet, balanced farming system.
I think one of the issues as well, in fact you raised this right at the beginning about waste. I think waste is a hugely important thing, but actually even before it gets to the table, one thing that's often overlooked, and so much effort is invested in protecting crops when they're in the field, but actually for most poor farmers, 40% of everything they harvest is lost. And if we were able to address that one issue, we could make a huge move towards much more sustainable food production.
I would add to that in kitchens as well. Lack of knowledge, maybe, sometimes, lack of training. Something, maybe kids should have cooking classes at school to, and to learn about the physical and molecular properties, learn about biology and history through food could be an interesting step forward also. But it's crazy how much food gets wasted in collective dining. You see broccoli, you eat the little flowers, and then you throw away the stem because some people don't know how to use it. Yeah,
half of that, 40% of that in general.
Yeah, exactly. So this is a huge increase in yield.
I won't waste any of that.
But even without going to the parts that we don't normally eat, I mean, in the UK, the households throw away 7 million tons of food, and most of that, half of that is things that we would eat normally, and it just gets wasted because we either buy too much and don't use it before it goes off, or we actually cook too much for the family and we end up throwing it away.
Where are these on here?
These are under here. So they're sliced thinly, just with a bit of olive oil and salt, very simply here.
In there?
Yeah,
Can you see
you can try them if you want.
So I'm intrigued. I eat the leaves of the leek, but I never knew you could eat the
with this?
the roots.
This is a meat substitute that I found today here in Manchester. It's basically fermented soybeans. Yeah. But then there are plenty also of food engineers, let's say, that are looking at how to reproduce the texture, the visual appearance of meat, and that's something that's going to be very big in the next.
So you'd recommend that with that?
Yeah, of course. Also, if you want to try a potato with sunflower.
So this is because I would throw this away, just the leaves of the.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to try
so did you use the roots?
Yes, I use the roots. The roots are right here. Yes.
Very good.
I'm interested in those.
John,
And
I have a question.
I've never.
Can you say what have you done with that? Because
really nice,
it looks like it'd be very if I ate that, it'd be very tough.
Yes.
What have you done?
Well, the thing is, even conscious farmers, what they do is just they cut the roots and they cut the heads. When really, the only thing that should go to waste in a leek is just the little bits that connect the stem to the roots, because it's very hard. It's woody, but the rest of all, it's completely edible. So it's also about raising awareness on the consumption side. So if we ask for more whole kind of plants, root to flower, we will get more of that in our farmers market, and also they will see probably an opportunity, farmers, to sell their produce a bit better.
It goes back to something I was saying about supermarkets. Often supermarkets sell prepackaged vegetables that will just be a very small proportion of and so a lot of waste goes on there too.
Charles, I come from Norfolk, and we very much appreciate samphire from about mid-August until September. It's a very short season. How would you feel? I mean, how would you feel about extending the growing season of samphire so that you could have it for a slightly longer period?
Yeah, that'd be great. So that's something that you can do.
How would you feel about a genetically modified samphire
of course.
would have such an extended growing season? And I think, well, maybe it's a trivial point, but I think a more profound point is that if we're going to get people interested in healthy diets, not just sufficient diets, but really healthy diets, to have diversity and have variation is hugely important. And so if we could make samphire more popular, for example, then that would be good from a sustainability point of view, but good also from a dietary point of view as well.
And the question is, how do you make these things popular? And that's where maybe food culinary trends play a huge role, chefs play a huge role, and to make these ingredients that are often overlooked, make them nice, make them beautiful, that has the texture of a sausage a little bit.
It does, yeah. What is this?
So it's fermented soybeans.
Fermented soybeans?
Yeah, it's like a little sausage. You find it in vegan stores.
I wish you could taste it. I'm conscious we're running out of time just today. You just find it. We haven't talked about these yet.
Yes.
I'm less interested in that.
Yes. So
can you show that?
So these are insects that are actually they're actually mealworms and crickets, and these are some of the most delicious that I found. Some guys that are sustainably farming them, and we did a research project with Charles Pence, trying to understand what were the best cognitive arguments to convince people to adopt insects in their diets. And often policymakers, even product designers, they go and say, okay, it's good for your health, it's good for the environment. But so we haven't published the research yet, but the idea is that saying that other people are doing it, that it's becoming a trend, actually makes the food taste better. So really people enjoy it more than when they're told it's healthy. So we should kind of also create trends that are fun and that are sustainable at the same time. And so in between, there's also, so there's these insects that you should definitely try. Here I wanted to talk about maybe something you could have at breakfast that we rarely think of. It's bee pollen. We need more bees. We need more pollinators. We know there's this colony collapse disorder happening worldwide. And consuming bee products is also delicious, and you can give back to nature in a way, because you're not only consuming something, but you're putting more pollinators to fly, millions of bees to go and pollinate our landscapes. So this is bee pollen. This is one variety from the Mediterranean. It smells very, very good, and it's very rich in protein. And this is honey mixed with pollen, with propolis. So you have all these ingredients that we need to see more of in the shelves, in the supermarket shelves, which is basically, we can call it a superfood if you want, but it's thinking also that if we, with our money every day, we put a vote on a particular organization or a particular brand. So.
Good?
If it's good enough for bees, is it good enough for you? Come on, I've got to have a try.
Oh, well, I think we probably just about run out. Did you talk about the
beer?
Yeah,
this is. I've been waiting for this one. I want to try this.
So,
I've been waiting all night for this.
So the idea here is that there's a very interesting project of some friends that are looking at crowdfunding fields. So you can own your own wheat field, basically, and you can put some opinions on how it should be farmed. And so basically one day you'll be able to own a certain percentage of the wheat field that is used to make this beer. So that's the idea. Also trying to put more mind into how farming is made and learning more about it.
Wonderful. Are you going to sample the beer?
We've got to do it.
I really don't want to eat one of those. Don't do that to me. I don't know. I know it's probably a wonderful thing.
I'm a vegetarian.
So am I at the moment.
Although I don't eat things with 4 legs or feathers, but this hasn't got either.
And I'm vegetarian then for similar reasons to Ottoline.
What I'm going to do is sample the beer.
Something which is eating something else.
I'm going to have to do this. Go on.
Are you?
Go on, you try some. I'll try some with you. Go on. It's just like
actually a perfect snack for the pub.
It's just like a prawn, isn't it?
Well, exactly.
Salty, crunchy.
Are they dead?
Okay.
It's good, no?
Actually, they're quite nice.
Are they? Yeah. Well, I should say, so thank you very much.
Pleasure.
I wish you could taste this stuff.
Thank you.
Can you pass it round? Yeah. You could pass it round. Shall I do that? Shall I do that?
Oh, that's very nice, actually.
I'll just pass it round. I know many of you won't get it, but let me pass it round because it's just if you want to take a little bit. There you go. Pass it. And pass it around. There you go. All right. It's fantastic. It'll probably get there. Oh,
this is the stamp, the tops of the meat. And this is the potato.
Right. Okay. So you're probably the first to ask a question now if I pass it out to the audience. So we've got just a few more questions, we've got about 20 minutes or so. A question asked by Talat and Marilyn, which is, I'm actually asked that one, sorry. There we are. A question asked by Hugh, which is, if we must use GM crops, which is kind of a loaded question immediately, but maybe you address that as well. How can we stop agribusiness from owning the rights to everything? Now, we touched on that already, but it's one of the key concerns, isn't it? So what policy initiatives could you imagine to stop that? If indeed you want to stop it.
Well, I think first we have to recognize that that's the case. So today about the three biggest firms own the market for 50% of our seeds worldwide, and the 7 biggest own 71% of the seed market. So a few firms really control a lot of the seed market, and there's similar figures for the pesticide and fertilizer market. So there are a few very large firms that control that market. And in fact, they're consolidating and buying each other off at the moment as well. So they're becoming even bigger, and so a smaller number of firms controlling more and more of the resources and the inputs that go into agriculture. So that's a really an important issue that needs to be recognized, and I think I would say addressed, because it limits the kinds of innovation that we get. So it goes back to the discussion we had before the tasting. It's partly because of that we have the GM crops that we have, and I think around this panel we're all quite fairly dissatisfied with the kind of GM crops that we have, and if we're going to have GM crops at all that we feel can contribute to sustainable agriculture and to feeding the world, we want different kinds of GM crops, which are probably not going to be produced by those big companies, because they have their main interest, and it's legitimate, is to make money, which is why they want to have patents on their seeds, for example. So, I mean, there's been challenges on there've been legal challenges on the idea that it's allowable to patent genes, but that's on ethical grounds, but that hasn't succeeded so far. But that would be one issue, to say, well, actually, because as we talked about before, somebody making a GM crop, they've got the 20,000 genes, I think you said, that's in the crop, and they put one gene into that crop, and then suddenly they have ownership of that new variety. And that could seem unfair, because for thousands and thousands of years, we've been other farmers throughout millennia have worked on that crop to make those 20,000 genes. So why should suddenly one company own that new crop that's just got 1 or 2 new genes? So that's a real issue that's been debated. It's been challenged in court at the moment. The big companies are still winning that. And then in terms of, I mean, consolidation of the market is really difficult to do anything from governmental bodies. I think we need to find ways of facilitating smaller companies. I think David wanted to say something, maybe.
Well, I think there's one reason predominantly why we don't have a more diverse biotechnology industry, and it is because the regulatory process is not functional. So within the regulatory process, there's one body that makes a scientific assessment of whether or not a crop is safe and would be appropriate for introduction. And then we have a political process superimposed on that can take on board or not the scientific assessment. And we've got, certainly within the European framework, we've got crops that have been going through this process for more than a decade, and still no decision has been made. So it's not surprising that there aren't any small companies that have been set up to take advantage and to advance all of the opportunities that could and do exist. And I think that if we could streamline this regulatory process, then we would get away from the hegemony of these few large companies.
You mentioned regulation a few times, actually, and this is a wider issue, isn't it? It's scientific advice in general, actually. So you get the scientific advice, as you said. You referred to questions about the safety of the crops, etc., which are assessed, and then the advice goes through the political process. So you've talked about streamlining that, but the tension is always that, of course, scientists can't make the decisions alone. So how would you streamline that process? It's relevant not only to this area, but to many areas, I think.
I don't have a short answer to that. I mean, one thing I do recognize is that you cannot force things on people, and so it doesn't matter if the scientific assessment comes out one way. If people don't want to have it, then you can't force that down their throats. And I think that hopefully by having events like this, where we can air the issues, this will make it possible to have, let's say, a more balanced regulatory process in the long run.
Yeah, I mean, I have a slightly different perspective on this. I think it's difficult to say that there's a scientific process which is somehow neutral and non-political, and then a political process that's superimposed onto that. There are politics and there are value judgments that go into the scientific process. They go on in the labs and the kind of experiments people do, and go on in those scientific expert committees where people make decisions. So in terms of like deciding what counts as something harmful, so whether we're going to be looking at the spread of invasive weeds that was mentioned earlier. Initially, that wasn't considered to be an environmental risk because that's not going to impact on the agricultural system. Or whether we're going to compare the GM crop to conventional industrial farming that we have in our countries at the moment, or whether we're going to compare it to organic agriculture or to some kind of agroecology. Those are judgments which are made by those scientific committees about what to use as comparators. And they're often not made in a very transparent way, and then they come out as the scientific evidence says this or that. And in fact, in some scientific committees don't have a consensual view on some of these things. And the other issue is the long-term effects we talked about that can't be assessed in the short term, so that can't really be made. So there's been a political judgment to say, well, we're not going to address that as an issue immediately.
So I would agree that these are, I mean, they're very complex issues, but again, to me, we spend a huge amount of time worrying about how to do this with respect to GM, when really we should be trying to design a system that works for any crop at all. And the notion that one has to wheel into place some elaborate system to license one GM crop, but all kinds of other crops that are not GM can merrily be put out into the field without any consideration about the new agricultural practices that come with those or any environment. It makes no sense at all. I think we need an overall framework that works for all the crops and all the new agricultural practices that we want to roll out, and which would include some kind of monitoring. And then, of course, you have to have a balance between something that allows innovation, the benefits of innovation to happen, so not so restrictive that you can never do anything new, but at the same time does indeed take into account that anything new comes with the unknown unknowns that David mentioned. But the notion that there are different or more or whatever unknown unknowns with a particular technology to make a new crop versus another one, I think it's not helpful. And so we're letting some things rush out into the fields completely unregulated, whether other things that would be beneficial are just getting snared up in red tape of one kind or another.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with that. I just think sometimes in this debate people argue for the GM regulation to be streamlined or to be lowered so that everything was lowered, instead of, I think, maybe we should need a framework which incorporates GM and non-GM new varieties in the same way, and I would agree with that. And also exactly your point about benefits. What happens at the moment is that scientific expert committees are only supposed to look at the risks, at the harms, and they're not supposed to look at the benefits. But what happens is because they're human beings, and if they think something like, if it's their favorite GM and they really think it's going to have a beneficial impact in the world, they are more likely to balance that in their judgment. Not to ignore the risks, but to take that into account into their judgment. And that's sort of normal and natural, but at the moment it's not done in a transparent way where that's part of the process and we can see how the benefits and the risks have been evaluated and balanced off against each other.
So there's a question from Daisy and Kate, which I think we're beginning to get to the end now, and it's really probably the central question, which is very simply, can advances in food production, GM or otherwise, keep up with global population growth? So maybe.
Well, I think they can. Certainly, my experience in the southern part of the world, where crop yields are extremely low, and there's plenty of opportunity to improve productivity in those environments. And we have an opportunity as well to do it in a way that's, I guess, environmentally benign, or as environmentally benign as it possibly can be. But if you imagine, one of the crops I work with at the moment is the field bean, Phaseolus vulgaris. Currently, farmers in Tanzania are getting somewhere between 500 and 600 kilograms a hectare, when if you were growing that in a more advanced country, you'd be getting 3,000 kilos per hectare. So there's a huge amount of room for improvement. But I think also one thing I mentioned earlier, an area that we really need to focus on and gets overlooked, is what happens once we've harvested. And we lose so much of that in the southern part of the world. In the northern hemisphere, everything gets stored in containers where we can control the environment and atmosphere. We don't really lose very much. It's all stored perfectly. But in the southern part of the world, a huge amount of harvested food is lost and therefore wasted. And if we can start to address both the yield potentials and storage of food production in the southern hemisphere, then we'll be doing a much better job of addressing this long term, I think.
I suppose you see the complexity, don't you? Because that goes to power grids and availability of energy and all sorts of problems. Virtually every problem that's faced by those countries feeds into this.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. And of course, we need to continue to increase food production if the world population is going to increase. But I do think we need to bring this into context. It's not just about new seed varieties. It's about agricultural practices and a lot of social innovation and a lot of things like, you just mentioned, transport and storage and wastage. 30% of the food produced in the world today does not reach people's stomach, but possibly as much as 50%. In developing countries, it's issues that, like Phil mentioned, about how it's stored and transported. It's not transported to the market quick enough. In the UK, in developed countries, it's in the home or in the supermarkets that wastage is happening, but it's a similar amount. And then the other thing is we have enough food to feed the world today, and yet 2 billion people in the world are malnourished, don't get enough food. At the very same time, 1.9 billion, almost the same. So the International Food Policy Research Institute, which is one of the international CGIAR institutes, produces a global nutrition report every year. And last year they measured and they realized that there's 2 billion people who don't get enough food. There's 1.9 billion people in the world today who are overweight or obese. So we have almost the same number of people who don't have enough food and who have too much. And we're actually beginning to see people who are both overweight and malnourished at the same time. So within the same country, we have people who are undernourished and overnourished, and we have some individuals who are obese and don't actually have the right amount of nutrients. So those are very important issues about equality and power and the whole food system that go beyond, how do we just increase food yields in the field.
I think the question comes into very sharp focus in certain parts of the world where population growth is likely to be the greatest. So we talk about the almost inevitability that there will be, at some point over the next 30 or 40 years, 9 billion people on the planet as opposed to the 7 billion that there are now. Most of those extra 2 billion people will be in certain restricted parts of the world, sub-Saharan Africa, Southeast Asia. Those are the regions where production is going to be an imperative. And so, yes, they need to improve the infrastructure, yes, managing the food supply system so that waste is minimized and so on and so forth. But there's a very pressing need to increase the potential of those regions to be able to produce their own food. And the sort of science that we've been talking about today will be a component. It's not the only bit, but it'll be a component of that.
So, yeah, I mean, I think most of it's been said already. The goal, I mean, one of the things that I think is frustrating in all these kinds of debates is that more or less everybody wants the same thing. I mean, almost everybody wants there to be, a secure, environmentally sustainable supply of safe food for everybody. And that's the starting point. Then how do you get that? It's a very complex problem, and it's a very, that involves politics and economics and sociology and science. And so it's very multifaceted. And what people would like when facing a big, scary problem is a silver bullet, and there are none. And so the notion that, it's a big, complex problem, so GM won't help, for example, so why should we do it? That's a non-starter. GM can provide solutions to tiny bits of the puzzle, and so we should use it. Meanwhile, less waste will provide solutions to a different part of the puzzle, and we should do that. So I think that these either-or debates are extraordinarily unhelpful in a system that requires everything. Every tiny drop of solution that you can put into the bucket, we need to do.
Okay, well, I think we have to come, sadly, to the final question. It's a very good question asked by Philip, so I'll ask it to everybody, which is, what is the one thing I should start doing tomorrow to help secure sustainable a sustainable food supply?
Well, I'll come back to the comment I made when we were eating food, and that was to eat less. I think that's really the thing we all can do with. Eat more slowly and eat less. That would be the one thing I would advise. And be happy to pay more for food, actually. I'd be happy to, if I could control my intake, I'd be happy to pay more for quality food, but eat less of it.
But that's here, though, of course, isn't it, in the UK? Because as you said, there are large areas. For someone here.
Yeah.
But I suppose there's also a broader question of what, because our governments, would you lobby for something as well? Right? There's personal behaviour, but what would there be something you would ask for? If you could go to whoever's running the country at the moment and say, do this, what would that...
I'll answer that, but the first thing, if we're thinking about what we in this room can do is like eat more lentils and eat less meat. I think that's just one thing we can all do tomorrow. And in terms of where we want to put pressure on, I mean, I think one of the things would be about limiting food marketing by corporations and supermarkets. I don't know if it was in the news today, something that's actually from us, ex-students of us set up this lobbying organization called Action Against Sugar. And they were part of the movement that got the sugar tax taken up by the government. And then this week they've been producing data about the amount of sugar which is in cakes sold, in lots of cafes and everywhere. Now we don't need that much sugar in the cakes. So there are NGOs out there. There's more and more of them who are lobbying governments and corporations and doing some fantastic work. And I think we need to be supporting them and getting involved with them and getting our voices heard that way.
I think a lesson from our chef this evening was taking food seriously is hugely important. So having beautiful food, having food that we recognize as being part of our culture will help us then to get serious about the very important issues that we're talking about this evening. So let's not lose sight of the fact that food is actually wonderful stuff. We don't have to eat loads of it, we just have to enjoy it and enjoy what it looks like as well as what it tastes like.
Yeah, so what can I add to all that wonderful advice? I guess I would say take your brain into the supermarket with you. So as we've discussed, it's a complex issue, and there's lots of people trying to sell you stuff in the supermarket, and you've got everybody has their preconceived ideas about what's healthy or what's the right thing for the environment, whatever. Try to walk into the supermarket, yes, with your brain and figure it out as you go around. What do you really need to buy? What do you really want to eat? What do you really enjoy? What's going to stop you throwing stuff away? What's going to minimize your carbon footprint? That kind of stuff. It's not that hard to do. And if you're taking food seriously, as David suggested, it becomes an enjoyable part of your life.
Well, thank you, and thank you all. We've run out of time very sadly, so I'd just like to thank our panelists, Ottoline, David, Claire and Phil. So thank you. Thank you. Okay, and also I'd like to thank Charles Michel for the, many of you ate the food. That was terrific stuff, so thanks, Charles. You're there. I should also thank, although I didn't try them, the Dundee Science Centre for the delicious edible insects. Of course, the Royal Society for hosting this event, and you for your wonderful questions. So thank you very much. And just very finally, there is a copy of this discussion. It's been filmed. It will be on the Royal Society website, which will link to the Royal Society's YouTube page, so you can watch the whole thing again if you want to get more detail. But for now, I'd just like to say thank you very, very much indeed. Thank you.